Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Okay. From the beginning, my objective was to analyze both Bosnia and Georgia's political realities and motivations for seeking EU membership, and how both countries capitalized on a sudden impetus for the EU's enlargement process, which was triggered outside the EU and outside any of the candidate countries, which was the war escalation since February 2022 between Russia and Ukraine. My primary assumption, I started to write this in August 2022, was that it was difficult to find an objective European Union view on these countries, given that, of course, there are 27 member states, each with their own differing foreign policies. The EU institutions also have some political autonomy of their own. So I tried to find both high-level statements from political leaders within the EU member states, particularly Germany and France, but also leaders within the EU institutions, like the President of the European Commission, the European Council, the High Representative for the Union, and also some annual assessments that the EU publishes on each of the 6 Western Balkan states, Turkey, and also from February 2023 onwards, so a full year after the war. Also, some analytical reports, which are a bit less in depth, but still just as comprehensive, on Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. So, first, a not so analytical, but more informative timeline I found it useful to include, that illustrates the impetus for the enlargement process. So in record time, 3 post-Soviet states, all European with frozen conflicts before the war escalation, made a formal request for EU candidate status, with Bosnia following in their footsteps, despite already requesting said status in February 2016. In record time, the Commission issued its opinions on the 3 eastern states about 3.5 months later, since the request, compared to the 3.5 years it took for Bosnia to receive its opinion. A similar period, a few years, was also taken for the Western Balkan states, which had requested its status, with Turkey being a bit of an outlier since it presented its request and candidate status many decades before. Now, semantics play a relevant role in these opinions, which are also commission-made and sponsored by every single member state by unanimity. Both Ukraine and Moldova were tasked with 9 steps before accession. Nevertheless, they achieved candidate status. On the other hand, Georgia was tasked with 12 priorities before accession, and it should also report on its advances before getting candidate status, exactly as Bosnia in 2019 with its not 12 but 14 priorities. Now, there is no single document which presents the enlargement process in an objective and simple manner. I chose the word saga, the EU accession saga. It may sound too lyrical and subjective, but it is strangely appropriate given the complexity that the EU made of its enlargement processes since 2004. As for the 6 stages, I will describe each of them briefly. First, an applicant state submits a formal request to the EU Council. Georgia is currently in the first stage. Second, the permanent representatives in Brussels decide by unanimity to request a mandatory opinion from the Commission, which is then approved by the European Parliament by simple majority and seconded by the European Council via unanimity. Third, the now candidate state agrees on a pre-accession strategy with the Commission, which evaluates or screens the candidate considering the so-called Copenhagen criteria, which are political, economic, and legislative. So the capacity to incorporate the legislative conglomerate of the EU, the so-called acquis, or acquis communautaire. Bosnia is currently on the verge of reaching this stage. On the fourth stage, negotiations begin proper, coordinated by the Commission and the European Council, which evaluates the state of play for each of 6 clusters, containing a total of 33 chapters, which regulate every aspect of a country's functioning. This is where Serbia, Montenegro, Turkey, North Macedonia, and Albania currently stand. There was no clear definition of a potential candidate, despite being referenced in a number of documents. The next step is the formal conclusion and closing of all chapters, followed by the preparation of a treaty of accession. And finally, it is granted an acceding country status, which will be upgraded to a proper EU member state at the date provided for the treaty of accession. The definition of potential candidate that you see on the slide is my own. So because it was not possible to find an objective one via high-level statements and documents published by any of the EU institutions. In this table, you may see every milestone achieved by every candidate and potential candidate. I will not go over every detail in this table, but the dates should present a few relevant aspects. The time relation between the association agreements and the accession request, which in the Western Balkans were closely knit, so in very close dates. The time between said request and the Commission's opinion is also largely coherent within Turkey and the 6 Western Balkan states, with Bosnia having the largest hiatus, so 3.5 years as previously mentioned, while post-Soviet states took only 3.5 months. The impetus within the enlargement provoked by the war is also made apparent by the amount of milestones which you may see shown in the table within 2022, compared to any other year, with a very large hiatus since 2016 and the beginning of 2022. To focus on Bosnia and Georgia's specific case, as previously mentioned, there are no progress reports, which are the quintessential assessment the EU provides for each candidate state. But the analytical reports use the same structure. Again, they are less in depth, yes, but they use the same structure and are just as comprehensive. I will show at the end of the presentation a table, but Bosnia currently holds the lowest aggregate score targeted Moldova, despite having an average score in the internal market cluster, therefore faring better at the economic criteria than all 3 post-Soviet states and Kosovo. Georgia, on the other hand, is a tier above with Ukraine, while faring even better than Kiev in the internal market and competitiveness and inclusive growth clusters, falling a bit behind Albania, which is a veteran candidate from over a decade. The remaining clusters, however, present a very poor showing for both states. The Commission stated in 2022 that Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia would get their own progress reports in 2023, yet it chose to anticipate this in February 2023 with similar reports, the so-called analytical reports, which might indicate that Brussels also wanted to show its efforts an exact year after the war escalation. Now, since I started writing the paper in August 2022, there was no common metric at the point between all candidates and potential candidates. There were some reports relating to the association agreements between the country and the EU, but the structure was different. There was a few relevant documents from a think tank, the Center for European Policy Studies, with its own informal opinions on Ukraine and Moldova, but not on Georgia. They did not include it in the metrics related to every other candidate and potential candidate, and citing the issue of their request as a dubious application. The internal politics of countries, of course, are never stagnant. And this is especially true with Bosnia and Georgia, as specifically with Bosnia, as my colleague previously stated in his presentation. However, when there was an escalation within the ruling elites of both countries, the EU sought to mediate, and the commitments between all involved, while similar, were not upheld to the same degree nor for the same duration. The EU made a positive assessment of Bosnia's general elections in October 2022. The general elections elect both the president and the parliament for at both state level and entity level, so both the Federation and Republika Srpska, and also the tiny territory called the Brko district. The conclusion that the EU presented regarding these elections and the proper support from October 2022 led to Bosnia's candidate status in this December European Council meeting between heads of state and government. Despite all of Bosnia's heterogeneity, they observed the common position regarding the EU on our accession to this organization was beneficial to all Bosnian peoples, in particular the three constituent peoples, Serbs, Bosniaks, and Croats, and efforts had to be made regarding its priorities, especially the political ones, but these could be achieved during candidate status and not before. This circumvents the fact that, as I'll show afterwards, its aggregate score was lower than Georgia's on all dimensions. Now, I don't think we should ignore the role of geography in policy making, the so-called geopolitics. When looking at a map of Europe, one notices that Bosnia, as my colleague showed, besides Kosovo, is surrounded by veteran candidates and even some EU member states like Croatia and Slovenia. Such is also the case with Moldova, wedged between a belligerent Ukraine, that is currently in the spotlight of international affairs, and Romania, another EU member state. Despite having issued a formal request at the very same day as Georgia, Moldova's enlargement process is more closely tied with Ukraine, where again political polarization, or lack thereof, plays a role. Now, it's not that political instability does not exist in Moldova and Ukraine, or that they are homogeneous societies, far from it. But the EU question is very clear-cut from 2022 onwards, not only among its populace, but also the political and economic elites. One can say the same about Georgia, even with the recent March pro-EU protests. Given the
Pedro, sorry to interrupt you, but you have just a couple of more minutes, okay? Like 5 minutes.
Of course,
to
no problem.
Conclusion. Thank you.
Yes, no problem. Given the fractures within Georgia between the president and the prime minister, and even within the government and its relation with former political figures, Russia's economic weight in Georgia is also much more prevalent than it is in either Ukraine or Moldova, especially after the thousands of Russian escapees from the mobilization efforts to the war. We may also not ignore geography-wise that Georgia, despite sharing a border with Russia and having two separate quasi-states within its territory, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, is not perceived with as much urgency as Moldova's Transnistria, an older and more dormant frozen conflict. Not only that, Georgia shares a border with only one EU candidate, Turkey. Otherwise, it can only turn to Armenia and Azerbaijan, which are not interested in EU accession, a belligerent Russia, and an increasingly militarized Black Sea. Nevertheless, there is yet a slight hope. The EU's High Representative, Josep Borrell, visited Georgia last week, and the country continues to be mentioned and equated in the EU's rhetoric and practical efforts regarding its enlargement process. Due to its role in European affairs, I chose to isolate one quote from German Chancellor Olaf Scholz in his so-called Prague speech, showing a maximalist approach to EU enlargement, speaking of a Europe of 36, that is, including the 6 Western Balkan states and the 3 willing post-Soviet states. Now, this was a table which I previously mentioned, I'll use the color scheme since I found it easier to illustrate how the EU perceives each candidate in its progress reports and analytical reports, in what dimension, in what cluster do they fare better, and so forth. As you may see, the scores decrease from left to right. I am aware that this is not a complete innovation. When I started writing this paper in August 2022, I didn't find any table, any methodology alike. Since then, think tank European Stability Initiative started to use a similar metric with both color schemes and point-based rankings. But again, the methodology is slightly different, and the points derived from specific sentences that from uniform language that the EU uses in every one of its reports. It is, as I hope, as objective as it can be. So that is it. Thank you for your time.